We are beginning a new sermon series today. Last term we reflected on the most famous sermon ever preached, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This term we're going to delve further back into the Bible's portrait of the good life as we examine the most famous moral code in history, the Ten Commandments. Do you know the Ten Commandments? In the original Anglican prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, candidates for confirmation are required to know three things by heart: the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed. Over the next 10 weeks, we'll take our time and look at one commandment each week. Today we'll look at the opening verses of Exodus 20 and the first commandment. Let me give a little context before that. The Ten Commandments have a special place in Old Testament law. While it's a bit complicated working out all the comings and goings of Moses up and down Mount Sinai at this moment in Israel's history, it seems that the Ten Commandments were spoken directly to the people, not mediated by Moses like the other laws. And other passages talk about the Ten Commandments as written by the finger of God, a reference to the famous 2 stone tablets that God gave to Moses, whereas the other laws were dictated to Moses. So the Ten Commandments were delivered differently. Their content is distinctive too. Unlike the detailed Old Testament case law, the Ten Commandments don't contain penalty clauses. And how could a legal system enforce the 10th commandment about coveting anyway? The Ten Commandments are more foundational, like constitutional law, given first to establish a broad framework for the life of God's people. When we turn to the New Testament, we find all but one of the Ten Commandments reaffirmed. The one that isn't explicitly applied to Christians is the commandment about the Sabbath. We'll think more about that in a few weeks. Last term in the Sermon on the Mount, we saw how Jesus not only reaffirmed the commandments, but in a sense made them more demanding as he teased out their underlying intentions, teaching that anger could be the equivalent of murder and lust the equivalent of adultery. So the significance of these commandments is not limited to the life of Israel in the Old Testament. These words speak to us as God's people today. These words speak to us as God's people. That leads to one final observation about the context of the Ten Commandments, which is vital for understanding how to apply them today. They do not concern mere personal morality, but rather the life and mission of God's people. Listen to these words spoken by Moses in Deuteronomy before he repeats the Ten Commandments. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? God's commands are not only for the individual believer, but for God's people. And part of their purpose is that God's people, in living God's way, will cause the nations to marvel at the greatness of God's people, which reflects God's greatness. Peter Enns puts it like this: there is a corporate dimension involved when God's people speak of the Ten Commandments. His law is to be followed not so that individuals can show their worth before God, and certainly not so that they can either earn or secure their salvation, but so that God's people can show the world the kind of God they worship. Now let's take a few minutes to look at Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 3. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Here at the beginning of Exodus 20, and similarly at the start of Deuteronomy 5, where the Ten Commandments are reiterated, we learn three remarkable things about the Bible's vision of the good life. First, it doesn't begin with us, but with God. And God spoke all these words. Catherine and I are enjoying the Netflix series The Crown. An episode we watched recently has a scene where Prince Philip speaks with the troubled Princess Diana, urging her to understand her place in the royal family she has married into. As the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip himself has had to set aside many personal ambitions, plans and longings. At one point in this conversation with Diana, he says, this whole family revolves around one person, and it seems to me that you're confused about who that person is. One of the most astonishing claims of the Bible, from the first verse of Genesis onwards, is that there is one true and living God, the King, around whom all of life revolves. He is the God who is there, the God who speaks and reveals himself and his will. By the way, what we know as the Ten Commandments are often simply described as words that God spoke. The God who legislates and instructs us how to live as his people. The God whose person and action define the very nature of goodness. If there is one true and living God, the first commandment follows naturally. You shall have no other gods before me. God is not saying you shall have me as your favorite God. He is saying you shall have me as your only God. You shall not acknowledge any other God. You shall not worship or serve any other God. You shall not love any other God. It's not so much that exclusive worship is Israel's duty, but that God is worthy. There is one true God, and we should love him. So when Jesus is asked which is the most important commandment, he draws on these words from Deuteronomy 6 that we hear regularly in our service. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. So the Bible's vision of the good life begins with God, the one true and living God. Indeed, if you take the true and living God out of the picture, it's hard to provide a solid foundation for any vision of the good life. Monotheism grounds morality. John Dickson writes, the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, is first not just because it concerns the first priority, our Creator, but also because it grounds all the other commandments in a coherent reality. The Bible's vision of the good life doesn't begin with us, but with God. Second, it doesn't begin with rules, but with relationships. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. The covenant stipulations do not begin with rules or with abstract philosophical reflections on the good life, but with relationship, a relationship with God, a relationship established by God, an exclusive relationship. What's more, the whole of the Ten Commandments are about relationships. The first four concern our relationship with God, and the last six concern our relationships with other people. That's why Jesus, when asked which was the greatest commandment, added a second: you shall love your neighbour as yourself. In the 10 Commandments and the 2 Great Commandments, love of God and love of neighbour are connected. So the Bible rejects both religious hypocrisy, claiming to love God but ignoring your neighbour, and agnostic morality, trying to live a good life and do good to your neighbour but ignoring God. That's why in the prayer of confession that we often say together, we acknowledge our failure in both areas, our failure to love God wholeheartedly and our failure to love our neighbours as ourselves. The Bible's vision of the good life begins with God, not us, and with relationships, not rules. Third, it doesn't begin with punishments and rewards, but with grace. In his book, Letters to a Young Lawyer, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz criticises any religious motivation for morality as essentially immoral. The pious, he reckons, only do good to avoid eternal punishment and reap divine rewards. Hell and heaven provide the inspiration for ethics. This means religiously motivated behaviour is at its heart selfish. The atheist, on the other hand, is apparently free from all such fear or approval seeking and can pursue the good for its own sake. The unbeliever alone has a noble incentive for the good life. Richard Dawkins follows suit. Do you really mean to tell me that the only reason you try to be good is to gain God's approval and reward and to avoid his disapproval and punishment? He asks of an imaginary believer, pondering whether one can be good without God. That's not morality, he insists. That's just sucking up. There are 2 big problems with this caricature. First, there is nothing inherently wrong or distinctly religious about motivating good behaviour through promises of reward for obedience or threats of punishment for disobedience. Have you ever paid a speeding fine? I've paid one in Mexico. I live in fear of speeding fines, especially with all the different speed limits in Melbourne, and that encourages me to drive carefully. It would be great if I were motivated by sheer love of neighbour, but when I'm stressed or distracted or running late or frustrated by traffic, the extra motivation is helpful. Second, while the Bible contains many promises of reward and threats of punishment, they are not the driving motivation for biblical morality. For that, we need to look again at what comes immediately before the first of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God's people had been slaves in Egypt for centuries. Now God has rescued them so they can live in freedom as his people in a new land. God's instructions show his people how to live in the freedom he has won for them. And that's real freedom, the freedom to be who you were made to be. That's the story arc of the whole book of Exodus. First, redemption, when God rescues the Israelites from Egypt. Then covenant, as God instructs the Israelites how to live as his people. Then worship, with the building of the tabernacle. God redeems a people to be in relationship with him and worship him. That's the consistent shape of biblical ethics and the Bible's vision of the good life. You are loved. Now obey. The order is incredibly important. Christians, you don't obey God because you hope that he will love and save you. You obey God because he has loved you and saved you. Thousands of years before you were born, God sent Jesus to die for your sins. Before the creation of the world, he decided to do that. Now he calls you to live in the freedom of the relationship He has established. There's more. The grace that motivates our obedience also rescues us from our disobedience. It deals with our failures. Jesus speaks about human beings as slaves who need to be rescued, not from slavery in Egypt, but from slavery to sin. And through his death and resurrection, he is the rescuer. You are loved. Now obey.